Santa Rosa was supposed to be just another conquered kingdom in Miguel Ortega's empire, a dusty town where hope died quietly and resistance was a forgotten word. For 2 decades, El Diablo's golden desert eagle had written his laws in blood and bone, teaching an entire generation that monsters wore expensive suits and collected souls like trophies. But tonight, the devil himself paces his fortress with trembling hands, watching security feeds for glimpses of a ghost. Because somewhere in the darkness a shadow moves like death itself, the daughter of a man he killed, carrying 8 years of training and her father's last breath like a blade against his throat. They say El Diablo fears nothing, but he never faced an enemy who learned to fight while watching him torture her father. Never hunted prey who spent every night since childhood choreographing his end. Never realized that when he created a town of victims, he was really breeding an army of vengeful ghosts. For Isabel, this isn't just about revenge, it's about teaching cartels why shadows are meant to be feared. And tonight, Santa Rosa will learn that some daughters carry revolution in their blood. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Miller's diner, its neon sign flickering weakly against the backdrop of the Mexican jungle. The small town of Santa Rosa lay nestled between the dense forest and dusty mountains, a forgotten place where hope came to die, and secrets thrived in the shadows. Frank Miller wiped his weathered hands on a dish rag, watching as an unfamiliar figure approached his establishment. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, carrying a small duffel bag over her shoulder. She wore faded jeans and a plain white t-shirt that had seen better days. But it was her eyes that caught Miller's attention. Dark, alert, carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "Help you?" Miller asked, setting aside the day's newspaper, its headlines screaming about another cartel-related disappearance. "I saw the sign," she said quietly, nodding toward the help wanted notice in the window. "Need a waitress?" Miller studied her for a moment. The last 3 girls he'd hired had quit within a week, scared off by Miguel El Diablo Ortega's men. "What's your name?" "Isabel." "Last name?" "Just Isabel." Her voice was soft but carried an edge of steel that made Miller raise an eyebrow. He nodded slowly, knowing better than to push. In a town like Santa Rosa, questions were dangerous things. "Any experience?" "Enough." She stood perfectly still, her posture betraying a discipline that seemed out of place in a diner applicant. 10 minutes later, Isabel had the job. The diner needed help, and Miller had learned long ago that in Santa Rosa, the less you knew about someone, the better you slept at night. Word spread quickly about the new girl at Miller's. In a town this small, any change rippled through the community like stones cast in still water. The housewives whispered over coffee, spinning theories about where she came from. Some said she was running from an abusive boyfriend in Mexico City. Others claimed she was an orphan with nowhere else to go. A few suggested she might be DEA, but those voices quickly fell silent when Rico, Ortega's chief enforcer, started asking questions about such rumors. Isabel worked efficiently, speaking only when necessary. She took orders, served food and cleaned tables with mechanical precision. But her eyes never stopped moving, watching, assessing. She noticed how conversations died when certain men entered the diner. She saw how mothers pulled their children closer, how shopkeepers suddenly found reasons to be busy in their back rooms when black SUVs rolled down the street. The afternoon heat had just peaked when 3 of those SUVs pulled up outside Miller's, kicking up dust that drifted through the diner's open windows. The regular customers tensed, and Miller's hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee. Rico entered first, his heavy boots echoing on the linoleum floor. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to his collarbone, a souvenir from what he called business negotiations. 2 of his men flanked him, hands resting casually on the guns visible beneath their jackets. "Frank," Rico drawled, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "How's business?" "Same as always, senor." Miller's voice was steady, but his eyes wouldn't meet the enforcer's gaze. Good, good. Rico drummed his fingers on the counter. Then you won't have any trouble with this month's protection payment. In fact, given how well things are going, El Diablo thinks it's time for an adjustment. Insurance costs are going up these days, you understand? Isabel moved silently behind the counter, refilling coffee cups. Rico's eyes followed her, a predatory smile spreading across his face. New girl? He asked, though he clearly knew the answer. Didn't think you were hiring, Frank. Just started, Miller mumbled. Rico leaned forward. Got a name, Benita? Isabel met his gaze. For a fraction of a second, something flashed in her eyes, something cold and sharp that made Rico's smile falter slightly. Isabel, she said, then turned away to serve another customer. Rico watched her move through the diner, his expression darkening. Make sure she understands how things work in Santa Rosa, Frank. Would hate for such a pretty thing to get into trouble. Later that night, after the diner closed, Isabel walked the quiet streets alone. The moon cast enough light to illuminate the path to her small rented room above the town's only bookstore. But she didn't go home. Instead, she made her way to an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. The barn's wooden walls creaked in the warm night wind as Isabel moved through a series of fluid motions. Her strikes were precise, practiced, lethal. She wasn't just exercising, she was rehearsing. Each movement flowed into the next with deadly grace, the kind that only comes from years of training. A noise outside made her freeze. Through a gap in the wooden slats, she saw a young boy, maybe 12 years old, watching with wide eyes. Their gazes met, and for a moment, neither moved. That was amazing, the boy whispered. Where did you learn to move like that? Isabel's expression softened slightly. You shouldn't be out this late, it's not safe. I'm Mateo. He stepped closer to the barn. My dad's the local newspaper writer. Well, he was before. He trailed off, looking down. Before what? Mateo shrugged, but his shoulders tensed. Before El Diablo told him what stories he could write. Isabel knew that name well. Miguel El Diablo Ortega, the man who ruled Santa Rosa with blood and money. His cartel controlled everything from local businesses to the police force. The town was his kingdom, and his word was law. You should go home, Mateo, Isabel said softly. The night belongs to dangerous people. Everything belongs to dangerous people now, Mateo replied with a wisdom beyond his years. But he turned to leave, pausing at the barn door. Will you be at the diner? Tomorrow? Isabel nodded and Mateo smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen in this town. The next day brought more unwelcome visitors to Miller's. Isabel was cleaning tables when she overheard two of Ortega's men talking in a corner booth. They spoke quietly, but years of training had sharpened her hearing. El Diablo wants the journalist, and his kid taken care of, one said, his voice barely above a whisper. Can't have them digging into the new shipping routes. Tonight? Yeah. Make it look like they left town. No traces. Isabel's hand tightened on the cleaning rag, but her face remained neutral as she moved to other tables. Inside, her mind was already calculating, planning. She had come to Santa Rosa tracking bigger prey, but she couldn't ignore this. Mateo's innocent face flashed in her memory, and she knew her plans would have to change. The afternoon brought more tension as Miguel Ortega himself made an appearance in town. His black Mercedes rolled down the main street like a funeral procession, people scattering inside shops and homes at the sight. Isabel watched through the diner window as Ortega stepped out of his car, his expensive suit pristine despite the dusty air. A local man, Robert Taylor, who owned the hardware store, had been accused of helping the DEA. Whether the accusation was true didn't matter. Ortega had decided his fate, and in Santa Rosa, El Diablo's decisions were final. The gunshot echoed through the town. Nobody screamed, nobody ran. They'd learned long ago that drawing attention only brought more violence. Isabel watched as Ortega laughed, wiping Taylor's blood from his shoes before getting back into his Mercedes. As the sun set, casting an orange glow over the desert town, Isabel walked back to her room. Inside, she pulled up a floorboard and retrieved a small black bag. The contents reflected the dying sunlight: a ceramic knife that wouldn't set off metal detectors, a coil of thin wire, and other tools of a trade most people never knew existed. From another hiding spot, she took out a phone, a burner, untraceable. She typed out a message. Found Ortega's operation. Complications. Will proceed as planned. The reply came seconds later. Remember your training. No witnesses. Isabel deleted both messages and destroyed the phone. In the distance, dogs barked, and car engines rumbled. Ortega's men beginning their night patrol of the town they terrorized. She changed into black tactical gear, strapping the knife to her thigh. Her movements were methodical, practiced, the result of years of preparation. This wasn't how she had planned to reveal herself, but plans change. Sometimes the best way to hunt a monster is to let it think it's the hunter. Through her window, she could see Rico and his men loading weapons into their vehicles. They would be coming for Mateo and his father soon. The cartel's enforcers were used to dealing with scared civilians, with people who could be cowed by threats and violence. They weren't prepared for what awaited them tonight. Isabel checked, her equipment one final time. The symbol of La Sombra, a shadowy figure wrapped in darkness, was etched into the handle of her knife. It was a name that still sent shivers through the criminal underworld, a legacy she carried in her blood. As night fell over Santa Rosa, Isabel disappeared into the shadows. In her place emerged something else, something that would make Miguel, El Diablo. Ortega remember why people fear the dark. The warm night air carried the scent of desert flowers and approaching rain. Soon it would carry something else, the first whispers of a legend reborn, of a shadow that moved like death itself. The cartel thought she was just a girl, another nameless face in a town they owned. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Overhead, dark clouds gathered as the night deepened. In the distance, engines roared as Ortega's men prepared for what they thought would be a simple kidnapping. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the hunters would become the hunted, and Santa Rosa would witness the beginning of a war that would shake the foundations of El Diablo's empire. The first drops of rain began to fall, nature itself setting the stage for what would become known as the longest night in Santa Rosa's history. By morning, the town would learn that monsters aren't always the ones who look frightening. Sometimes, they're the ones who rule through fear, and sometimes their worst nightmare comes in the form of a quiet girl with deadly eyes, a shadow among shadows, carrying death in her silent footsteps. The real story of Santa Rosa was about to begin, written in blood and whispered in fear. The war was coming, and Isabel was ready. The night air vibrated with the distant sound of engines. 3 black SUVs snaked through Santa Rosa's empty streets, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside the lead vehicle, Rico checked his phone. A message from El Diablo glowed on the screen. No mistakes tonight. Mateo was finishing his homework when the first rock shattered his bedroom window. Glass sprayed across his desk as voices shouted from outside. His father burst into the room, face pale with fear. "Under the bed now," he ordered, but it was too late. The front door exploded inward, wood splinters flying as armed men stormed the house. Mateo's father tried to shield him, but a rifle butt caught him in the stomach, doubling him over. 2 men grabbed Mateo, his screams muffled by a rough hand across his mouth. "Your fucking articles," Rico spat, kicking Mateo's father as he lay, gasping on the floor. "Should have stuck to writing about local parades and quinceañeras." He nodded to his men. "Take the kid, leave the message." They dragged Mateo toward the waiting vehicles. His father struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip. "Please," he begged, "he's just a boy." Rico's pistol cracked across, his face sending him sprawling. "Be grateful El Diablo wants you alive to suffer." He leaned close, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. "Write one more word about the cartel and we'll send your boy back in pieces." As they pulled away, Mateo saw his father through the SUV's tinted window on his knees in their doorway, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then the night swallowed everything, but other eyes watched from the shadows. Isabel had been tracking their movements since sunset, her black tactical gear blending perfectly with the darkness. She followed the convoy at a distance, moving through backyards and alleyways like a ghost. The cartel's safe house sat deep in the jungle, 20 minutes outside town. A former hunting lodge converted into a fortress, its location was known only to Ortega's inner circle. As the SUVs approached, Isabel was already in position, having used the local terrain to get ahead of them. From her vantage point in a dense tree, she counted 12 men, 4 at the perimeter, 2 by the main entrance, and 6 more inside with Mateo. Rico barked orders as they dragged the boy into the building. "Nobody in or out without my say-so. El Diablo himself is coming to deal with this one." Isabel waited until the guards settled into their routine. The first one died without a sound, a wire around his throat, pulled tight as she dropped from above. She lowered his body silently into the underbrush, already moving toward her next target. The second guard had just lit a cigarette when Isabel's ceramic blade found the soft spot beneath his jaw. His lighter clattered to the ground as she eased his body behind a stack of fuel drums. 2 down. Inside the safe house, Rico paced before a terrified Mateo, who sat tied to a chair in the main room. "Your father thought he could expose our routes, our operations." He grabbed the boy's chin. "Actions have consequences, Niño." A sudden noise from outside made Rico pause. "Check the perimeter," he ordered 2 of his men. They nodded, drawing their weapons as they stepped into the darkness. Isabel was ready. She'd set a simple trap, a tripwire connected to a falling branch. As the guards investigated the noise, she struck from behind. One died from a knife between the ribs, the other from a precise blow to the throat that crushed his windpipe. Neither had time to radio for help. The compound's power failed suddenly, plunging everything into darkness. Emergency lights sputtered to life, casting eerie red shadows through the windows. Rico grabbed his radio. "Report! Someone fucking report!" Silence answered him. "Find out what's happening," he snarled at his remaining men. "Now!" They moved cautiously toward the exits, weapons raised. Isabel watched through the windows, counting heartbeats. Timing would be everything. The first guard stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The bullet that killed him came from his own partner's gun. Isabel had positioned the bodies so that in the dim emergency lighting, shapes and shadows played tricks on panicked minds. "Holy shit!" The second guard fired wildly into the darkness, emptying his magazine at nothing. As he fumbled to reload, Isabel's wire found his throat. Inside, Rico heard the gunfire cease. His radio crackled. "Status report. What's happening out there?" Sweat beaded on his forehead as silence answered him again. A body suddenly crashed through the window, landing in the center of the room. One of their own men, eyes wide and lifeless, a familiar symbol carved into his chest, the mark of La Sombra. Rico's face went pale. "No," he whispered. "It's not possible." The remaining guards huddled together, guns pointed at every shadow. In their fear, they made a crucial mistake. They forgot to watch above. Isabel dropped from the rafters like an avenging angel. Her first kick shattered a kneecap. As that guard fell screaming, her knife found the second man's heart. The third managed to fire once, the bullet whisking past her ear before her elbow crushed his throat. Rico grabbed Mateo, pressing a pistol to the boy's head. "Stay back," he shouted at the darkness. "I'll kill him." "No." Isabel's voice came from everywhere, and nowhere you won't. The lights went out completely. Rico fired blindly, his muzzle flash illuminating empty air. When the emergency light sputtered back on, Isabel stood before him, her knife pressed to his throat. "Let him go," she said softly. "And I'll make it. Quick." Rico's eyes darted between her face and the exits. "La Sombra is dead," he spat. "Who are you?" His legacy. The knife pressed deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. "Choose." Rico shoved Mateo away and tried to bring his gun around. Isabel moved like liquid shadow, her blade opening his throat in a single, elegant motion. He fell, clutching at the wound. disbelief written across his face as his life drained away. Mateo had squeezed his eyes shut during the violence. He felt gentle hands untying his bonds. Then a soft voice. "It's over. You're safe." He opened his eyes to see Isabel. Not the quiet waitress from the diner, but something else entirely. A warrior wrapped in shadows, death incarnate, yet her touch was tender as she checked him for injuries. "My father," he whispered. "Is alive," she assured him. "But you can't go home. They'll look for you there first." She pulled a small phone from her pocket. "I have a contact, someone who can get you across the border. You'll be safe there." Mateo looked at the bodies scattered around them, at the blood-stained floors. What are you?" Isabel's eyes softened slightly. "Someone who couldn't. Stand by and watch them hurt an innocent boy." She handed him a small pendant bearing the shadow symbol. "If you ever need help again, show this to the right people. They'll know what it means." She led him through the jungle to a waiting car, driven by an old woman who asked no questions. As they pulled away, Mateo looked back to see Isabel melting into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness she commanded. The night wasn't over. Isabel retrieved her phone and sent a message. "Package secure, moving to phase 2. The response came immediately. "El Diablo is en route, 15 minutes. She moved quickly, preparing the scene. Each dead guard was positioned. Carefully, their bodies telling a story of panic and friendly fire. On Rico's chest, she carved the symbol, her father's symbol, deep and clear. A message that would send shockwaves through the cartel's hierarchy. When Miguel El Diablo Ortega arrived, his convoy of armored vehicles illuminated the safe house like daybreak. He stepped out, impeccably dressed as always, a golden desert, eagle hanging at his hip. His men spread out, weapons ready, but it was too late. The scene that greeted them told a story of absolute chaos. Bodies lay where they had fallen, blood painting the walls and floors. Rico's corpse held center stage, the symbol on his chest a declaration of war. Ortega's face contorted with rage as he recognized the mark. "Search everything," he roared. "Find whoever did this." But Isabel was already gone, moving through the jungle like a phantom. Her mission wasn't just about saving one boy, it was about sending a message. The cartel's power wasn't absolute. Their reign of terror could be challenged. Back in Santa Rosa, dawn was breaking. Isabel slipped into her small room above the bookstore, washing away the night's blood and changing back into her waitress clothes. In a few hours, she would serve coffee at Miller's diner, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. By noon, word of the safe house massacre would reach every corner of Santa Rosa. People would whisper about the symbol, about the return of La Sombra's vengeance. Hope would begin to flicker in eyes that had been dead for too long. Ortega stood in his office, watching the sun rise over his kingdom. The golden desert eagle sat heavy in his hand as he examined crime scene photos from the safe house. His top lieutenants waited nervously as he studied the symbol carved into Rico's flesh. "Sir?" one ventured cautiously. "It can't be La Sombra. You killed him yourself 5 years ago." Ortega's fist crashed into his desk. "Then who?" he snarled. "Who would dare use this symbol?" The answer was already spreading through the criminal underworld. Whispers of a ghost, a shadow given form, death wrapped in a young woman's skin. The daughter of the man Ortega had murdered, returned to claim her birthright in blood. In her room, Isabel cleaned her weapons meticulously, preparing for the storm she had unleashed. The cartel would respond with overwhelming force. They could do nothing else. Their power relied on the myth of invincibility. She had just shattered that myth. Her phone buzzed, a message from her contact across the border. Mateo and his father arrived safely. "What's your next move?" Isabel didn't respond immediately. She walked to her window, watching Ortega's men flooding the streets below, their faces tight with fear. They knew now that the hunters could become the hunted, that their actions had consequences. She thought of Mateo, of his brave father, of all the others who suffered under the cartel's boot. This was never just about revenge, it was about justice, about breaking the cycle of fear that paralyzed places like Santa Rosa. Finally, she typed her response. I'm staying. The war has just begun. The morning sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, a fitting dawn for the new era Isabel had initiated. In the coming days, Ortega would unleash hell trying to find her. He would fail. A shadow cannot be caught, cannot be killed, and Isabel was more than just a shadow now. She was vengeance incarnate, justice in human form, the legacy of La Sombra, given purpose and power. The cartel had thought she was just a girl. Their mistake would cost them everything. The war for Santa Rosa's soul had begun, written in blood and whispered in fear. And Isabel, daughter of shadows, was ready to show. El Diablo himself, why even devils should fear the dark. Dawn painted the Mexican sky in shades of amber and crimson as Isabel guided Mateo through the dense jungle paths. The boy hadn't spoken since they left the safe house, his eyes still wide from witnessing the night's violence. The old church loomed. Before them, its stone walls weathered by decades of sun and rain, its bell tower reaching toward the heavens like a silent guardian. Wait here, Isabel whispered, checking the perimeter before leading Mateo inside. The church had been abandoned years ago, when the cartel's influence first began poisoning Santa Rosa. Now it served a different purpose, a waypoint for those fleeing El Diablo's wrath. Inside, dust motes danced in the rays of early morning light filtering through stained glass windows. Isabel moved to the altar, pressing specific stones in a precise sequence. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a small cache of supplies. Sarah will be here within the hour, Isabel said, pulling out a backpack and some clean clothes for Mateo. She runs a legitimate transport company, but she helps people like you get across the border. The cartel doesn't suspect her. Mateo finally found his voice. What about my father? Another contact is moving him through a different route. You'll meet in Arizona. She handed him a burner phone. Memorize this number, then destroy the phone. If something goes wrong, call it. Someone will help. Like you helped me? Mateo asked, his young face serious beyond his years. Isabel paused, studying him. In his eyes, she saw the same determination she'd carried at his age. After watching her own father die at El Diablo's hands. Yes, she said softly. Like I helped you. She left Mateo in the church's hidden room, knowing Sarah would arrive soon. The woman had been helping people escape the cartels for 15 years, ever since they killed her husband. She was one of the few who knew Isabel's true identity, one of the shadow network that had helped train her after her father's death. The morning streets of Santa Rosa were eerily quiet as Isabel made her way back toward town. El Diablo's men had been busy. Black SUVs patrolled every corner. Armed men questioned anyone foolish enough to be outside. They were hunting, but they didn't know what their prey really looked like. She needed supplies from her room above, the bookstore. The owner, Thomas Wells, was unlocking the front door as she approached. His hands trembled slightly. He'd already heard about the safe house massacre. Quite a night, he said quietly as she passed. Isabel paused. Stay inside today, Mr. Wells. It's going to get worse before it gets better. She had just reached her room when she felt it, the subtle wrongness in the air. The door was unlocked, but she'd left it locked. The window was open a fraction wider than she'd left it. Trap. Isabel spun, but too late. A taser struck her back, electricity coursing through her body. As she fell, strong hands grabbed her arms. Through blurring vision, she saw boots approaching. Expensive Italian leather. El Diablo himself had come to call. La Sombra's daughter. Miguel Ortega's voice dripped with false warmth. I've been waiting a long time to meet you. Darkness took her. Isabel awoke tied to a chair in what appeared to be a wine cellar, probably beneath Ortega's estate. Her head throbbed, but her mind was clear, already assessing the situation. 4 guards armed with automatic weapons. Ortega himself, his golden desert eagle gleaming at his hip. And off to the side, a man she recognized from intelligence briefings. William Stone, Ortega's chief torturer. Comfortable? Ortega asked, lighting an expensive cigar. I apologize for the crude accommodations, but you've caused quite a bit of trouble. Killing Rico, destroying one of my safe houses, helping the journalist brat escape. He blew smoke in her face. Your father would be proud. Isabel remained silent, but her eyes never left Ortega's face. He was older than in the photos she'd studied, more gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes. But the casual cruelty was exactly as described in her father's journals. Nothing to say? Ortega moved closer. No declarations of vengeance? No speeches about justice? Your father loved speeches. Right until the end, he kept talking about how someone would stop me. He laughed. Look how that turned out. I remember, Isabel said softly. I was there. That made Ortega pause. Impossible. There was no one else in the room when I killed him. I was in the walls. Father had shown me all the hidden passages in our house. I watched you torture him for 3 hours before you finally shot him. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes burned with cold fire. I saw everything. Ortega's smile faltered slightly. Then you know what happens to people who challenge me. Stone. He nodded to the torturer. Make her talk. I want to know everything about her support network, everyone who's helped her. Then kill her. Slowly. He turned to leave, but Isabel's voice stopped him. You still have his blood on your hands. Ortega turned back. What? My father's blood. You think you washed it off, but I can still see it. It marks you, like the symbol I carved into Rico's chest, a promise of what's coming. You're tied to a chair, about to die screaming, Ortega snarled. What's coming except your death? Isabel smiled then, a predator's smile that made even Stone step back. You're right. I am tied to a chair. There was a subtle clicking sound. I was 5 minutes ago, too. Want to know what changed? The lights went out. In the darkness, Isabel moved like a demon unleashed. The first guard died before he could raise his weapon, her hidden blade opening his throat. The second managed to fire once, the muzzle flash illuminating her for a split second as she drove her knee into his solar plexus. Stone rushed her with a knife, but she was already gone, flowing around his strike like water. Her elbow caught his temple, sending him sprawling. The remaining guards fired blindly, their bullets hitting nothing but stone walls and empty air. When emergency power kicked in, Isabel stood in the center of the room, her bonds lying broken on the floor. 4 guards lay dead or dying around her. Stone was unconscious, blood trickling from his ear, but Ortega was gone. Shouts and running feet echoed from above as more guards responded to the gunfire. Isabel quickly searched the bodies, finding what she needed: a radio, a keycard, and a handgun. Stone began to stir. Where is he? She demanded, pressing her blade to his throat. Stone coughed blood, his eyes unfocused. Kill me. I won't talk. You don't have to. Isabel knocked him out again, then used his phone to send a message to Ortega. Subject broke, heading for north exit with information about offshore accounts. She counted to 30, listening to the radio chatter as guards rushed to seal the north side of the compound. Then she moved south, using Stone's keycard to access the service tunnels that ran beneath the estate. Ortega's voice crackled over the radio. She's trying to trick us. Check all exits. Now. But Isabel was already gone, moving through maintenance, passages, and air ducts with the familiarity of someone who had studied the blueprints for months. Her father's intelligence network had provided detailed plans of every cartel property in Santa Rosa. She emerged from a drainage tunnel half a mile from the estate, just as sirens began wailing in the compound behind her. The morning sun was fully up now, and she needed to disappear fast. The streets were chaos as cartel vehicles raced past, all heading toward Ortega's estate. Isabel moved carefully through back alleys and service entrances, making her way to one of several safe houses she'd prepared months ago. This one was in the basement of an abandoned factory, accessible only through a series of connecting underground maintenance rooms. Inside, she found medical supplies, weapons, and fresh clothes, everything she needed to disappear or fight back. As she treated her injuries from the taser and fight, her secure phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. Package delivered safely, but we have a problem. Someone talked. Isabel's jaw tightened. A leak in the network. That explained how Ortega had known to look for her at the bookstore. She typed back. Need names. Working. On it. Be careful. Black Vultures inbound, the Black Vultures. Ortega's elite death squad. Mercenaries trained in counterinsurgency and assassination. Their arrival meant the cartel was escalating beyond local muscle. The real war was about to begin. Isabel changed into fresh tactical gear and began checking. Her weapons. The compound bow, silent and deadly. The ceramic knives that wouldn't set off metal detectors. The garrote wire that had already claimed so many cartel lives. Her father had trained her to use them all, starting when she was just 6 years old. After his death, others from his network had continued her education. Former special forces, intelligence operators, even other assassins. She had become a weapon, forged in grief and tempered by rage. But it wasn't just about revenge anymore. The people of Santa Rosa lived in fear, crushed under the cartel's boot. Children like Mateo grew up knowing nothing but violence and corruption. Someone had to break the cycle. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. They're starting house-to-house searches. The whole town is locked down. Isabel smiled grimly. Let them search. The frightened girl they were looking for didn't exist. In her place was something far more dangerous, a shadow given purpose, a weapon aimed at the heart of El Diablo's empire. She began preparations for what would come next. The Black Vultures were professionals, but they had one critical weakness. They weren't fighting for anything except money. Isabel was fighting for justice, for vengeance, for the memory of a father who died protecting others from monsters like Ortega. The cartel thought they had won by finding her hideout, by forcing her to run. They didn't understand that La Sombra's daughter was exactly where she wanted to be, in the shadows where she was strongest. As afternoon faded toward evening, Isabel sent her own message to Ortega's personal phone. You missed your chance. Now I'm coming for everything you love. She followed it with a photo. Ortega's private banking numbers, account access codes, everything he needed to move his money out of the country. The same information her father had died protecting. Her phone rang almost immediately. She let it go to voicemail, smiling as Ortega's rage-filled voice filled the small basement room. You think you can threaten me? I own this town. I own the police, the politicians, everyone. I killed your father and I'll kill you too. There's nowhere you can hide, nowhere you can run. I'll burn this whole fucking town down to find you. Perfect. An enraged enemy was a careless enemy. Isabel began moving her supplies to other locations, knowing the Black Vultures would eventually find this hideout. Let them come. Each cache contained surprises, traps for the unwary, messages written in blood. The sun was setting when she heard the first helicopters arriving, black shapes against the darkening sky, carrying death from above. The Black Vultures had arrived and the hunt was about to begin, but they didn't understand what they were hunting. They were looking for a girl, for La Sombra's daughter. They would find something else entirely, a ghost in the machine, a wraith that moved like death itself. Isabel checked her weapons one final time, then melted into the gathering darkness. The night belonged to her now, and she had work to do. The Black Vultures were about to learn why even trained killers feared the shadow. In his fortified compound, Miguel El Diablo Ortega stared at the photo on his phone, his hands shaking with rage. The ghost of a dead man's daughter had declared war on his empire, and for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd forgotten. Fear. The war for Santa Rosa's soul was about to enter a new phase, and Isabel was ready. The cartel thought they were the hunters, but they were wrong. The real hunt was just beginning. The Black Vultures arrived at midnight. 2. Unmarked helicopters touched down on the private airstrip outside Santa Rosa, their rotors kicking up clouds of dust in the moonlight. 10 figures emerged, moving with military precision, their black tactical gear absorbing what little light reached them. James Walker, former Delta Force operator and leader of the Black Vultures, studied the town's layout on his tactical pad. 20 years of wet work for the highest bidder had left deep lines in his face and gray streaks in his close-cropped hair, but his eyes remained sharp, predatory. El Diablo's paying triple our usual rate, he told his team as they gathered around their vehicles. Target is one female operator, early 20s, goes by Isabel, daughter of the original La Sombra. La Sombra? Ryan Brooks, the team's demolitions expert, spat on the ground. Thought that ghost story was dead. The father is. Daughter's very much alive. She took out Rico and his entire security team at the safe house. 14 trained shooters, dead in under 10 minutes. No gunshots, all close quarters kills. The team exchanged glances. They'd all heard stories about La Sombra, the shadow assassin who'd terrorized cartels across Mexico before Ortega finally caught him. If his daughter was half as skilled, split into pairs, Walker ordered. Brooks, Taylor, take the warehouse district. Phillips, Anderson, cover the residential zone. Rest of you, standard search pattern through the commercial area. Remember, she's trained in infiltration and close quarters combat. Don't let her get within knife range. The teams departed in black SUVs, their headlights cutting through the desert night. None of them noticed the figure watching from the water tower overhead, her bow already nocked with a carbon fiber arrow. Isabel tracked the vehicles through her scope, memorizing faces, counting weapons. These weren't cartel thugs. Their movements showed proper tactical training. This would require a different approach. She followed Brooks and Taylor to the warehouse district, moving silently across rooftops as they began their sweep. They were good, checking corners, covering each other's blind spots, maintaining proper spacing. But they made one crucial mistake. They looked for threats at street level. They didn't look up. Isabel waited until they split up to check parallel alleys. Brooks moved below her position, thorough but predictable. She fired a small electronic device onto a nearby transformer. 5 seconds later, the entire block went dark. Contact? Taylor's voice crackled over their radio. Brooks, report. Silence answered him. Taylor moved cautiously toward his partners. Last position, night vision goggles activated. He found Brooks unconscious, a needle in his neck loaded with fast-acting sedative. Before he could radio a warning, something whistled through the air. The arrow took his radio, pinning it to the wall along with a note. 2 down, 8 to go. Across town, Walker received the news with cold fury. All units converge on the warehouse district. She's hunting us. But Isabel was already gone, leaving a trail of evidence leading north while she moved south. The Black Vultures would waste precious time chasing shadows while she prepared her real target. Phillips and Anderson found a warehouse door slightly ajar, an obvious trap. They approached anyway, their confidence in their superior training and numbers overwhelming their caution. The flashbang that dropped from above caught them completely, off guard. As they staggered, blind and deaf, Isabel descended. Her first kick shattered Anderson's knee. Phillips managed to fire once, the bullet embedding itself in a wooden crate as Isabel's elbow caught his temple. Both men were unconscious before their radios crackled with Walker's voice demanding updates. Isabel took their weapons and ammunition, then left another message carved into a support beam. Your men aren't dead because I chose to spare them. Remember that. Walker ordered his remaining teams to pull back and regroup. This wasn't going according to plan. The target was supposed to be running scared, not systematically dismantling his operation. She's playing with us, he told his remaining men as they regrouped near the town square. Using our tactics against us. Standard military counterinsurgency won't work here. So what's the play? Asked Michael Carter, his second in command. Walker's face hardened. We change the rules. If she wants to act like a ghost, we'll give her something solid to fight for. He pulled out his phone and dialed Ortega. Isabel watched through her scope as Walker spoke with El Diablo. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she read his lips enough to understand the plan. They were going to take hostages, innocent townspeople, to force her into the open. Her jaw clenched. This was exactly what her father had warned her about in those long-ago training sessions. The truly dangerous ones, he'd said, will try to use your conscience against you. They'll threaten innocence, counting on your humanity to make you vulnerable. And what should I do then, Papa? She'd asked. His eyes had been sad but determined. You make them regret thinking your humanity is a weakness. Isabel moved quickly, sending messages through her network. Within minutes, the warning spread through Santa Rosa's shadow channels. Stay inside, lock your doors, tell everyone you trust to do the same. But she knew some wouldn't get the message in time. The black vultures were already moving, breaking into homes, dragging people into the street. Among them was Frank Miller from the diner and Thomas Wells from the bookstore. Walker's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Isabel, you have 1 hour. To surrender? Or these people start dying. 1 every 15 minutes until you show yourself. Isabel knocked an arrow, considering her options. She could probably take out Walker from here, but his men would kill the hostages before her second shot. She needed a different strategy. A plan formed in her mind, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but with a chance of success. She began moving, using the pre-positioned equipment she'd cached around town over the past months. 15 minutes later, as Walker prepared to execute Frank Miller, the first explosion rocked the southern end of town. A cartel weapons depot erupted in flames, secondary explosions lighting up the night sky. Sir, Carter pointed south. The cartel's main cash house is burning. Walker cursed. He knew Ortega would be screaming for them to protect his assets. But if they split their forces now, a second explosion lit up the west side of town. Then, a third in the east. Isabel's message was clear. For every hostage they threatened, another piece of Ortega's empire would burn. Protect the money, Ortega's voice screamed through Walker's phone. Kill the hostages if you have to, but save my property. Walker hesitated. In that moment of indecision, the streetlights went out. All of them, plunging the town square into total darkness. Smoke from the burning buildings filled the air, obscuring what little moonlight remained. The hostages had been prepared. As soon as the lights died, they dropped flat on the ground, making themselves small targets just as Isabel's messages had instructed them. She struck from multiple directions, using pre-planted speakers to throw, her voice making it seem like there were multiple attackers. The black vultures fired at shadows, their training wavering as doubt crept in. Carter died first, a wire around his throat yanking him into the darkness. 2 more fell to arrows fired from different positions. Walker ordered his remaining men into a defensive circle, but it was already too late. Isabel moved through them like a ghost, striking and vanishing, using their own tactics against them. A knife thrown from the darkness found one man's throat. Another fell to a blow to the back of the head as Isabel swung past on a pre-rigged zip line. When the emergency generators finally kicked in, Walker stood alone, his back against a wall, gun trained on the darkness. 6 of his men were dead, the other 4 unconscious or disabled. The hostages were gone, spirited away to safety through pre-planned escape routes. Come on, he shouted into the night. Face me. 1-on-1. Why? Isabel's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Because that would be fair? Honorable? She let out a cold laugh. You threatened innocent people. You don't deserve a warrior's death. The wire caught his gun hand first, pulling it wide. A second wire took his legs out from under him. As he fell, Isabel emerged from the shadows, her knife glinting in the emergency lights. Wait, Walker gasped. I can pay you double what Ortega's paying us. Isabel knelt beside him, her blade pressing against his throat. My father taught me that every kill should have purpose. That death should mean something. She leaned closer. Your death will show Ortega that no amount of money can buy him safety. That every mercenary, every killer he sends after me will meet the same fate. You're going to die, Walker spat. Ortega will bring an army down on this town. Good. Isabel's smile was terrible to behold. That's exactly what I'm counting on. The blade moved once, precisely. Walker's eyes widened, then dimmed. On his chest, Isabel carved the now familiar symbol of La Sombra. She left his body where It fell, a message to whatever killers Ortega sent next. The other black vultures who still lived would wake up in various places outside of town, each bearing non-lethal wounds and the same warning carved into their tactical gear. Never come back. The fires across town burned through the night, destroying millions in cartel money and supplies. Emergency services, long since bought by Ortega, didn't even try to fight the blazes. They just watched as his empire burned. In his fortified compound, Ortega received the news of the Black Vulture's defeat with uncontrolled rage. He shot the messenger who brought him the final casualty count, then ordered his remaining lieutenants to put bounties on Isabel's head, $10 million for anyone who could bring him her body, but money couldn't buy him safety anymore. As his lieutenants scrambled to enforce his orders, they found their phones flooded with messages, photos of their secret homes, their families, their mistresses, each image accompanied by a simple threat. Leave Santa Rosa or die. Some fled that very night, taking what money they could carry. Others fortified their positions, hiring more guards, installing more security. It didn't matter. The shadow of fear had taken root in their minds, and no amount of firepower could dispel it. Isabel watched from the rooftops as the sun rose over Santa Rosa. The night's events had changed everything. The cartel's mask of invincibility was shattered. Their best killers were dead or running, and the people of the town had seen that resistance was possible. Her phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. Mateo and his father crossed safely. They're asking about you. Isabel smiled slightly. Tell them I'm doing what needs to be done. The Black Vultures nearly succeeded with those hostages. Maybe it's time to pull back, go somewhere safer. No. Isabel's expression hardened as she watched Ortega's men scurrying through the streets below, like ants whose nest had been kicked. This was never about staying safe, it's about finishing what my father started. She checked her weapons, replenished her supplies, and began planning her next move. The cartel would be desperate now, prone to mistakes, and she would be waiting, a shadow of justice in a town too long dominated by evil. Let them come with their armies, their killers, their bounty hunters. Santa Rosa had found its protector, and the night belonged to her. As morning fully dawned, Isabel disappeared into the hidden passages and secret rooms that honeycombed the town. The next phase of the war was about to begin, and she had preparations to make. The cartel thought the Black Vulture's defeat was devastating. They had no idea what was coming next. The real hunt was about to begin, and this time, Isabel wasn't just fighting for revenge. She was fighting for the soul of Santa Rosa itself. The morning after the Black Vulture's defeat, Miguel El Diablo, Ortega stood in his office watching surveillance footage of the night's carnage. On screen, Isabel moved like a demon through his elite killers, each strike precise, each move calculated. His hands shook as he gripped his golden desert eagle. "Find her," he screamed at his gathered lieutenants. "Burn every building. Kill anyone who might be helping her. I want this town to learn what happens when they defy me." Within hours, Santa Rosa became a war zone. Cartel vehicles rolled through the streets, men with automatic weapons firing into homes and businesses. They dragged people from their houses, demanding information about Isabel. Those who couldn't or wouldn't answer faced immediate execution. At Tart Miller's diner, Frank had just opened for the morning rush when they came. 3 SUVs screeched to a halt outside, disgorging armed men led by one of Ortega's new lieutenants, a former Special Forces operator named Jackson. "This place harbored her," Jackson announced, leveling his rifle at Frank. "Time to send a message." They doused the diner in gasoline while forcing Frank and his customers to watch. When they lit the match, the building went up like tinder in the dry desert air. The screams of those trapped inside echoed across town. Isabel watched from a nearby rooftop, her knuckles white as she gripped her bow. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to save the innocent people dying in the flames. But tactical training won out over emotion. Moving now would only get more people killed. She wasn't alone in her grief. Throughout Santa Rosa, people watched their town burn with a mixture of horror and growing rage. Ortega had finally gone too far. The fear that had kept them compliant for so long began transforming into something else: determination. In the back room of his grocery store, William Hayes, a former Army medic, began treating wounded civilians who'd escaped the cartel's rampage. Anna Thompson, who ran the local hardware store, quietly distributed supplies to those who'd lost their homes. Officer David Parker, one of the few honest cops left in town, used his radio to warn people which streets to avoid. A resistance was being born in blood and fire. Isabel moved through the chaos like a ghost, using the network of passages and hidden rooms she'd prepared. At each stop, she left supplies, medical kits, weapons, burner phones programmed with secure contacts. The people of Santa Rosa would need them for what was coming. Her secure phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Cartels moving major assets out of town. They're scared." "Good," Isabel replied. "Time for phase 2. She made her way to Ortega's personal estate. The compound was a fortress, ringed with armed guards and security cameras. But like all fortresses, it had weaknesses, and Isabel had spent months studying them all. Using a maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the property, she planted explosive charges at key structural points. Not enough to destroy the building, but enough to send a message. On her way out, she left her calling card, the shadow symbol, painted in luminescent ink that would only become visible in darkness. That night, as Ortega hosted a meeting with his remaining lieutenants to plan their next move, the charges detonated. The explosions weren't meant to kill. They were meant to terrify. As smoke filled the compound and alarms blared, guards rushed to protect their boss. But Isabel wasn't there to kill Ortega. Not yet. This was psychological warfare, designed to show him that nowhere was safe. When power was restored, they found her symbol glowing on every wall of his private office, a haunting reminder that death could come at any moment. Ortega's rage reached new heights. He ordered his men to round up every person who'd ever worked at Miller's Diner, every customer who'd regularly eaten there. One by one, they were brought to the town square for public execution. But this time, something different happened. As Jackson raised his rifle to shoot the first victim, a shot rang out from a nearby building. Jackson fell, a bullet hole precisely placed in his forehead. More shots followed. The resistance Isabel had helped arm and train emerged from hiding, taking up strategic positions around the square. Officer Parker led a group of fellow cops who'd finally chosen to fight back. William Hayes coordinated medical teams to help the wounded. Anna Thompson's people provided covering fire from the hardware store roof. The cartel forces, expecting easy prey, found themselves caught in a crossfire. They retreated in disarray, leaving their vehicles and several dead behind. For the first time in years, the people of Santa Rosa had fought back, and won. Isabel watched the battle from her sniper's perch, pride mixing with concern. The townspeople had shown courage, but their victory would come at a terrible price. Ortega would retaliate with everything he had. She wasn't wrong. Within hours, Ortega had called in his deadliest asset, a man known only as El Lobo, the Wolf. A former special operations commander turned cartel enforcer, El Lobo had a reputation for brutality that made even hardened criminals nervous. Isabel knew of him. Her father's journals contained detailed notes about El Lobo's tactics, his preferences, his weaknesses. He was an apex predator, but even wolves could be hunted. El Lobo arrived as the sun was setting, riding alone in an armored SUV. He was tall, heavily muscled, with a face scarred from countless battles. His eyes scanned the town like a hunter seeking prey. Isabel left him a message carved into the hood of his vehicle while he met with Ortega. The wolf hunts the shadow, but the shadow hunts him too. The game began at midnight. El Lobo moved, through the dark streets following subtle clues Isabel left for him. She was leading him away from populated areas, toward the abandoned industrial district where their inevitable confrontation would endanger no innocent lives. They finally met, in an old steel mill, moonlight filtering through broken windows. El Lobo carried an assault rifle and combat knife. Isabel had her bow and blade. La Sombra's daughter. El Lobo's voice was surprisingly soft. I knew your father. He was an honorable man. You worked for the monster who killed him. El Lobo shrugged. Money is money, nothing personal. It is to me. They moved at the same instant, El Lobo's rifle barking as Isabel rolled behind a rusted machine. Her arrow caught his weapon's strap, pinning it to a wall. He drew his knife as she closed with her own blade. What followed was a deadly dance of steel and skill. El Lobo was stronger, with years of close combat experience. But Isabel had trained for this moment since childhood, had studied his every technique and habit. Their blades clashed and sparked in the darkness. First blood went to El Lobo, his knife opening a shallow cut on Isabel's arm. She countered with a strike that sliced his thigh, slowing his movement slightly. They separated, circled, clashed again. Each exchange brought new wounds, new lessons. El Lobo's experience showed in his economy of movement, his ability to turn defense into sudden attack. But Isabel was younger, faster, with the burning purpose of vengeance driving her forward. The end came suddenly. El Lobo overcommitted to a thrust, expecting Isabel to dodge right as she had before. Instead, she flowed left, inside his guard. Her blade found his kidney as his knife scraped harmlessly across her tactical vest. Nothing personal, she whispered as he fell. El Lobo laughed, blood staining his teeth. Your father would be proud. They were his last words. Isabel left his body where it fell, another message carved into his chest. But this time she added something new beneath the shadow symbol. No more warnings. When Ortega's men found El Lobo's corpse, their feared enforcer dead in a pool of his own blood, something broke in their ranks. More lieutenants fled, taking their soldiers with them. Those who stayed demanded triple pay and additional security. But money couldn't buy loyalty anymore. Isabel's network had grown, spreading through every level of Ortega's organization. His own men began questioning his leadership, wondering if backing a losing side was worth their lives. Isabel used this chaos to strike at the heart of Ortega's empire. Secret airstrips were destroyed, drug shipments vanished, money laundering operations found their accounts emptied overnight. The shadow was everywhere and nowhere. In his compound, Ortega's paranoia reached new heights. He executed 3 of his own lieutenants, convinced they were traitors. His remaining men walked on eggshells, knowing any mistake could mean death, at their boss's hands, or worse, at the hands of the shadow that haunted their nightmares. Isabel coordinated with the town's growing resistance, providing intelligence and support while maintaining her distance. She knew Ortega would target anyone connected to her, so she moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. But the resistance grew stronger daily. Officer Parker organized his fellow cops into an effective security force. William Hayes established a network of underground clinics. Anna Thompson's people created safe houses throughout town. Santa Rosa was transforming from a cartel-controlled hell into a community united against tyranny. Late one night, Isabel used her thermal scope to watch Ortega pacing in his office. The once powerful cartel boss was deteriorating, jumping at shadows, trusting no one. Soon he would make a crucial mistake, and when he did, she would be ready. Her phone buzzed, a message from one of her informants inside Ortega's organization. He's calling in everyone. Full mobilization. Something big coming. Isabel smiled grimly. Let them come. Santa Rosa was no longer a town of victims. The people had found their courage, their unity, their strength, and they had a guardian in the shadows, a vengeful angel who moved like death itself. She began preparing for the final phase of her plan. Ortega would throw everything he had left at the town, a desperate bid to crush the resistance and restore his authority. It would be his last mistake. The war for Santa Rosa's soul was reaching its climax. Blood would flow, buildings would burn, lives would be lost. But in the end, justice would prevail. The shadow would make sure of that. As dawn approached, Isabel moved through her hidden network of passages and safe rooms, checking weapons and supplies. The next few days would determine everything. Either Ortega's empire would fall, or Santa Rosa would be destroyed in the attempt. She touched the pendant she wore, her father's last gift carrying the symbol that now struck terror into Cartel hearts. "I'm finishing what you started, Papa," she whispered. "The shadow of justice is falling, and this time the monsters won't escape." Across town, the resistance prepared for battle. They had learned from Isabel's example that fear could work both ways. The cartel had terrorized them for years, but now they were the ones who moved in darkness, who struck without warning, who vanished like ghosts. In his fortified compound, Ortega stared at tactical maps plotting his counterattack. But his hands shook as he marked targets, and his eyes darted constantly to the shadows in the corners of his office. The devil himself had begun to fear the dark. The war for Santa Rosa had entered its final phase. The shadow was rising and hell was coming with it. Miguel El Diablo Ortega's estate had become a fortress within a fortress. The sprawling compound, already formidable with its concrete walls and guard towers, now bristled with additional defenses. Military-grade spotlights swept the perimeter constantly, turning night into day. Mercenaries with thermal scopes patrolled every angle, their weapons trained on the darkness beyond the walls. Inside his office, Ortega sat behind a desk cluttered with tactical maps and security reports. His once immaculate suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. 3 empty coffee cups and a half-empty bottle of premium tequila testified to his state of mind. 10 million wasn't enough? He snarled into his phone. Fine, 20 million. Cash, plus another 5 for each of her allies you take out. He listened for a moment, then laughed bitterly. You're right, the Black Vultures thought they were ready too. But you're not them, are you, Mr. Cross? Nathan Cross, former CIA wetworks specialist, had assembled a team of private military contractors for this job. Unlike the Black Vultures, they weren't coming in overconfident. They'd studied every report, every security recording of Isabel's tactics. "We'll need full access to your security systems," Cross said. "And I want those Mexican Special Forces units you promised as backup. Done, just kill this bitch." Ortega ended the call and stared at the security feeds covering his office walls. Somewhere out there, in the darkness of Santa Rosa, she was watching, planning, waiting. Isabel observed the convoy of black SUVs entering town from her position on the church bell tower. Through her scope, she counted 12 vehicles, each carrying heavily armed operators. Cross's team had arrived. Her secure phone buzzed. A message from Officer Parker. Mexican military vehicles spotted on the highway. At least 50 men, heavy weapons. Another message followed, this one from William Hayes. Cartel offering locals cash for information. Some are talking. Isabel wasn't surprised. Fear and poverty were powerful motivators, but she'd planned for this, had spent months preparing for the final phase of her operation. She typed rapid responses. Parker, initiate protocol echo. Hayes, get your people to the fallback positions. It's starting. Across Santa Rosa, the resistance moved with practiced efficiency. Weapon caches were distributed. Medical supplies were positioned at key points. Civilians who couldn't or wouldn't fight were moved to prepared shelter areas. In his command center, Nathan Cross watched drone feeds of the town. His team had established a perimeter, blocking major roads and checking vehicles. The Mexican Special Forces units were positioning themselves at strategic points, their commanders coordinating with cartel lieutenants. She'll try to use the civilians as cover, he told his operators. We need to limit her movement options, burn out any buildings that could serve as sniper positions. The sound of explosions echoed across town as Cross's men began systematically destroying potential vantage points. Smoke rose from dozens of locations, creating a hazy ceiling that would limit visibility and make thermal imaging more effective. But Isabel had anticipated this tactic. The buildings they were destroying were obvious choices, too obvious. Her real network lay elsewhere, in places they wouldn't think to look. She moved through hidden passages between buildings, using maintenance, tunnels and forgotten spaces that didn't appear on any official maps. Her father's network had spent years creating this shadow infrastructure, and she'd expanded it further during her months of preparation. Cross's men were good. She had to admit that. They moved in coordinated patterns, covering each other's blind spots, maintaining constant communication. They weren't falling for the obvious traps she'd left. Time to show them something new. Isabel activated her own network of informants. Cartel soldiers found their radios filled with static and whispered warnings. Mexican Special Forces units reported phantom movements on their thermal scopes. Cross's operators began encountering evidence that they were being watched. Shell casings from their own weapons appearing in their secured areas, their own boot prints showing up where none of them had walked. Psychological warfare at its finest. "They're playing with us," Cross growled, watching his men grow increasingly paranoid. "Stay focused. This is what she wants." But Isabel's real target wasn't Cross's team. While they hunted shadows, she was systematically destroying Ortega's support structure. Police officers on his payroll received photos of their families along with evidence of their corruption and offers of immunity if they switched sides. Bank managers handling his money laundering suddenly found their accounts frozen by anonymous tips to financial authorities. The cartel's foundation was crumbling from within. Ortega felt his control slipping. More of his men were deserting, taking what cash they could carry. Those who stayed demanded impossible security guarantees. The Mexican Special Forces commanders were growing hesitant, worried about potential blowback if their involvement became public. In desperation, he reached out to his last resort, a man known only as the Butcher. Even in the violent world of cartel enforcement, the Butcher's reputation for sadism stood out. He had a personal vendetta against La Sombra's legacy, having lost an eye to the original Shadow years ago. "I don't care about your price," Ortega told him. "Just make her suffer before she dies." The Butcher's arrival changed the dynamic immediately. Unlike Cross's methodical approach, the Butcher believed in creating terror through spectacle. He began taking civilian hostages, conducting public executions, trying to draw Isabel into the open. From her hidden observation post, Isabel watched him murder a young mother who'd refused to give information. Her hands tightened on her rifle, but she forced herself to stay still. The Butcher was cunning. He'd positioned children in his line of fire, ensuring that any shot at him would risk innocent lives. "Come out, little shadow," he called into the night. "Or should I find more volunteers? Maybe that old man from the diner? Or the bookstore owner who gave you shelter?" Isabel's phone buzzed. "Sarah, the tunnel network is ready. Give the word, and we can evacuate the remaining civilians." Another message from Officer Parker. "My people are in position. The Butcher's not watching his back." Isabel smiled grimly. The Butcher, for all his brutality, had made a crucial mistake. He thought he was hunting her. He didn't realize he was being hunted. She set her plan in motion. First, the resistance activated the tunnel network, quietly evacuating civilians from the areas the Butcher was targeting. Then, Parker's officers began a series of coordinated strikes against cartel positions, drawing Cross's teams away from the center of town. The Butcher, frustrated by the disappearing civilian targets, grew increasingly erratic. He ordered his men to begin burning entire blocks, not realizing he was following Isabel's carefully prepared script. The confrontation came at midnight. The Butcher was executing another hostage in the town square when Isabel finally revealed, herself stepping into the open with her hands raised. "Here I am," she called. "Let them go." The Butcher smiled, his scarred face twisting grotesquely. La Sombra's little girl, finally showing some spine. He pressed his gun to the hostages. "Head, drop your weapons, all of them." Isabel complied, seemingly surrendering. But as the Butcher approached to gloat over his victory, she made her move. The square erupted in chaos as hidden resistance fighters opened fire from multiple positions. The Butcher's men, caught in a perfectly planned crossfire, fell before they could react. The Butcher himself was good. He managed to wound 2 of Parker's officers before Isabel reached him. What followed was a brutal close-quarters fight, knife against knife. The Butcher's experience showed in his vicious attacks, but Isabel had trained for this moment. She took a cut to her arm, another to her leg, but her counters were precise and deadly. When the butcher overextended himself trying to gut her, she caught his arm and turned his own blade back into his chest. "My father sends his regards," she whispered as he fell. The butcher's death broke something in the cartel's ranks. Cross's mercenaries, seeing the writing on the wall, began negotiating their withdrawal. The Mexican special forces, already uncomfortable with the situation, pulled back to defensive positions outside town. Ortega watched his security feeds in growing panic as his forces crumbled. Isabel had turned his own tactics against him, using fear as a weapon. But she wasn't just terrorizing his men, she was offering them choices: surrender, switch sides, run. Many took the offers. By dawn, Ortega's once mighty fortress was manned by a skeleton crew of his most loyal, or most frightened, soldiers. Cross's team had withdrawn, taking their expensive equipment and expertise with them. The Mexican special forces had officially never been there. In his office, Ortega stared at his golden Desert Eagle, the weapon that had ended La Sombra's life years ago. Would it end his daughters as well? Or would she be the one to end him, Isabel? Watched the sun rise over Santa Rosa, her night vision goggles showing her the true state of Ortega's defenses. The resistance had grown stronger than anyone expected, with Officer Parker's people now controlling most of the town. William Hayes had transformed his underground clinics into a proper medical network. Even the civilians who couldn't fight had found ways to contribute, creating supply lines and communication networks that kept the resistance functioning. This was what her father had dreamed of, not just killing cartel members but helping people find the strength to resist them. The shadow wasn't just one person anymore, it was an idea, a symbol of hope in the darkness. She checked her weapons one final time. The compound bow, silent and deadly. The ceramic knives that had claimed so many cartel lives. The garrote wire that brought swift, quiet death. And something new. Detailed plans of Ortega's compound, including the secret escape tunnel he thought no one knew about. Her phone buzzed one last time. A message from Mateo, safe across the border. "Make him pay for what he did to our town." Isabel smiled as she typed her response. "Watch the news tomorrow. Things are about to change in Santa Rosa." The final battle was approaching. Ortega had nowhere left to run, no more mercenaries to hide behind. Soon the devil himself would learn why even monsters fear the shadows, and Santa Rosa would be free. Thunder rolled across Santa Rosa as storm clouds gathered above Ortega's compound. The remaining cartel soldiers huddled behind reinforced positions, their weapons trained on the darkness beyond the walls. Lightning flashed, illuminating empty streets and abandoned buildings. But they knew they weren't alone. She was out there, watching, waiting. Inside his command center, Ortega watched security feeds with bloodshot eyes. The golden Desert Eagle sat on his desk, its surface reflecting the blue glow of monitor screens. Dozens of angles showed the approaches to his fortress, each covered by enough firepower to stop a small army. "Report," he barked into his radio. "All quiet, sir," his security chief responded. "No movement on thermal or night vision." Of course not, Ortega thought bitterly. She wouldn't be seen unless she wanted to be. The first explosion caught everyone by surprise. A massive fireball erupted from the compound's north wing, sending debris and bodies flying. Before the guards could react, two more explosions rocked the east and west walls. "We're under attack," voices screamed over the radio. "Multiple breaches." Gunfire erupted as Isabel's allies struck from prepared positions. Officer Parker led a team hitting the main gate, while resistance fighters under Anna Thompson's command targeted guard towers with precision rifle fire. William Hayes coordinated from a mobile command center, directing medical teams and support units. But this was just the distraction. Deep beneath the compound, Isabel moved silently through maintenance tunnels. Her father's intelligence network had provided detailed blueprints, including secrets that even Ortega didn't know. While the cartel's remaining forces focused on the external assault, she was already inside their defenses. Above, chaos reigned. The resistance fighters had learned well, using tactics Isabel had taught them. They struck from multiple angles, never staying in one position long enough to be targeted. Years of living under cartel oppression had taught them every corner of their town, and now they used that knowledge as a weapon. "Where are our reinforcements?" Ortega screamed into his phone. But there was no answer. His allies had abandoned him, his mercenaries had fled, and his empire was crumbling. A guard rushed into his office. "Sir, they've breached the outer wall. Thompson's people are—" The guard's words ended in a gurgle as a wire wrapped around his throat. Isabel emerged from the shadows behind him, lowering his body silently to the floor. "Hello, Miguel," she said, softly. Ortega lunged for his Desert Eagle, but Isabel was faster. A throwing knife pinned his sleeve to the desk, the blade vibrating with the force of impact. "Your father died begging for mercy," Ortega snarled, trying to hide his fear behind bravado. "No." Isabel moved closer, another knife appearing in her hand. "He died protecting the location of your offshore accounts, the same accounts I emptied last week." Ortega's face went pale. "Impossible. Those accounts were hidden, like the tunnel network beneath Santa Rosa, like the evidence of your deals with corrupt officials." Isabel's smile was cold. "My father's network never died, Miguel. It just went quiet, waiting for the right moment." Outside, the battle intensified. The resistance had breached the inner courtyard, engaging the remaining cartel forces in close-quarters combat. Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by deafening thunder. "You think killing me will end this?" Ortega laughed desperately. "There will always be another cartel, another boss. You can't stop." Isabel's knife flashed, opening a shallow cut on his cheek. "This isn't about stopping all cartels. It's about showing them that some places are too costly to control, that shadows can strike anywhere, at anyone." She pulled him from his chair, dragging him toward the window. Below, his men were surrendering to Parker's officers, throwing down their weapons as the resistance fighters moved through the compound with practiced efficiency. "Look," Isabel commanded. "Look at your empire burning." Ortega watched in horror as decades of power crumbled in a single night. The compound he'd built, the town he'd terrorized, the people he'd thought he owned, all of it slipping through, his fingers like sand. "The accounts were just the beginning," Isabel continued. "Every hidden asset, every secret deal, every dirty cop and corrupt judge, it's all been exposed. Your friends in government are being arrested. Your international partners are running scared." A massive explosion rocked the building, the resistance destroying his private armory. The lights flickered and died, emergency power casting the office in a red glow. "This is your legacy, Miguel. Everything you built, torn down by a girl you thought was just a waitress." Ortega's hand suddenly struck out, catching Isabel's knife arm. He was still strong, still dangerous. They grappled in the dim light, crashing into furniture as each sought an advantage. "I killed your father," Ortega grunted, managing to land a solid punch. "I'll kill you too." But Isabel had been trained for this moment since childhood. She flowed with his attacks, using his own strength against him. When he overextended himself, she struck, precise, brutal hits to vulnerable points. Ortega staggered back, blood flowing from his nose. "You're just like him," he spat. "So righteous, so sure of your cause, but you're just another killer." "No." Isabel moved like a shadow, her next strike dropping him to his knees. "I'm what you created. Every person you hurt, every family you destroyed, every life you ruined. I carry their vengeance." She could have killed him then, but that wasn't the plan. Instead, she zip-tied his hands and activated her radio. "Parker, the office is secure. Bring them up." Minutes later, Officer Parker arrived with several of his men and 3 federal agents who'd been waiting outside town. They'd been building a case against Ortega for years, but could never get enough evidence. Until now. "Miguel Ortega," the lead agent began, "you're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, drug trafficking, money laundering." The list went on. Isabel watched from the shadows as they led him away, the mighty El Diablo reduced to a handcuffed prisoner. But her work wasn't finished. Throughout the compound, resistance fighters secured documents, computers, and other evidence. William Hayes's medical teams treated wounded on both sides, while Anna Thompson's people began dismantling the cartel's remaining infrastructure. Isabel moved through the chaos like a ghost, ensuring nothing was missed. Every piece of intelligence would be valuable in preventing another cartel from filling the vacuum Ortega left behind. The storm broke as dawn approached, rain washing blood from the streets of Santa Rosa. Isabel stood on the compound's roof, watching her father's dream become reality. The town was free, its people had found their strength, and the Shadow's work was nearly done. Her phone buzzed, a message from Sarah. Mateo saw the news. He says thank you. Another message followed, this one from her father's old network, Phase 1 complete. Ready to begin Phase 2? Isabel smiled. Santa Rosa was just the beginning. Other towns suffered under cartel control. Other people needed hope in the darkness. The Shadow had more work to do. But first, she had one last task in this town. In Ortega's office, she found his golden Desert Eagle, the weapon that had killed her father. She disassembled it completely, then melted each piece down. The gold would be sold, the money used to help rebuild Santa Rosa. As morning fully dawned, Isabel watched federal agents leading the last cartel members away. Officer Parker approached, his uniform dusty from the night's fighting. The town council is meeting this afternoon, he said. They want to thank you properly. I won't be there, Isabel replied softly. The Shadow works best when it remains a story, a symbol. Let them tell their children that justice can come from darkness, that hope can survive even in the deepest night. Parker nodded, understanding. Where will you go? There are other towns, other cartels. The Shadow's work is never finished. She left Santa Rosa as quietly as she'd arrived, vanishing into the morning mist. But her legacy remained, in the freed town, in the strengthened people, in the stories they would tell of the girl who brought down an empire. The Shadow's war wasn't over. It was just beginning. In his prison transport, Ortega stared through rain-streaked windows at his crumbling kingdom. His empire had fallen not to rival cartels or federal agents, but to a waitress, a ghost, a shadow given form. He closed his eyes but could still see her, moving through his nightmares like death itself, a vengeful spirit that had shown the world that even devils could bleed. Santa Rosa would recover, would rebuild. Its people had found their courage, their unity, their strength. And somewhere in the darkness, the Shadow watched, ready to return. If evil ever again threatened the town she'd freed, the war for Santa Rosa's soul was over. The Shadow had won, but across Mexico other battles waited. Other towns cried out for justice. Other cartels thought themselves untouchable. They would learn, as Ortega had learned, that darkness holds more than just fear. Sometimes it holds vengeance. Sometimes it holds justice. Sometimes it holds a shadow that moves like death itself, bringing hope to those who had forgotten its name. The morning sun cast long shadows over the ruins of Ortega's compound as federal agents combed through the wreckage. Crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, marking where El Diablo had made his last stand. In the center of his former office, a chalk outline marked where they'd found him, not dead, but broken, his empire crumbling around him. The golden Desert Eagle was gone, along with the man who had terrorized Santa Rosa for so long. In its place, carved into his mahogany desk, was the Shadow symbol, a final signature on the end of an era. Officer David Parker stood in the doorway, watching forensics teams document everything. His uniform was still dusty from the night's battle, but he stood straighter now, pride replacing the weight of fear he'd carried for so long. "Sir," one of his deputies called from the hallway, "they found something in the basement." Below the compound, hidden behind a false wall, they discovered Ortega's true legacy. Rooms full of computer servers and paper records. Every transaction, every corrupt deal, every dirty secret he'd used to maintain control. The cartel's digital heart, laid bare for federal investigators. He documented everything, the lead agent said, amazed. Names, dates, account numbers, This is enough to take down half the corrupt officials in Mexico. Parker nodded, remembering Isabel's words. The shadow doesn't just kill, it exposes what hides in darkness. Across town, William Hayes worked tirelessly in his clinic, treating those wounded in the final battle. Both resistance fighters and former cartel soldiers lay in his beds. In Death's shadow, old rivalries meant nothing. "Doctor," one of his nurses called. Another donation arrived. Hayes opened the envelope, finding a stack of $100 bills and a note bearing the shadow symbol. For healing what violence breaks. The money would help rebuild the clinic, expanding it to serve more people. Already, Hayes was planning programs to treat those addicted to the cartel's drugs, to heal not just bodies but the town's wounded soul. Anna Thompson stood in her hardware store, now a hub for the town's reconstruction efforts. The shelves that had once hidden weapons now held building materials. The back room where resistance fighters had planned attacks was becoming a community center. "Ms. Thompson?" A young boy approached, holding a familiar pendant. "I'm supposed to give you this." The shadow symbol gleamed on the silver surface. Inside was a micro SD card containing detailed plans, infrastructure improvements, community programs, everything Santa Rosa needed to prevent another cartel from taking root. In the police station, Parker's phone rang. The caller ID showed a federal number. "We found Ortega's offshore accounts," the agent reported. "All empty, but the money's reappearing, being donated to schools, clinics, community programs across Mexico, always with that same symbol." Parker smiled. Isabel was ensuring that Ortega's blood money would help heal the wounds his cartel had caused. At the town's edge, Sarah watched the last refugee family cross safely into their new life. The underground railroad that had helped Mateo escape was working overtime, helping former cartel soldiers who'd chosen to defect, giving them a chance at honest lives. Going somewhere? Sarah turned to find Isabel emerging from the shadows. She looked different now. Not just the quiet waitress or the deadly warrior, but something in between. A legend preparing to become a ghost. "The network's expanding," Sarah said. "Other towns are asking for help. They've heard what happened here." Isabel nodded. "The Shadow's work is never finished. You could stay," Sarah suggested. "Help rebuild what you helped save." "No." Isabel's eyes turned north toward other territories, other cartels. "Santa Rosa needs to heal itself, to become strong on its own. My father understood that. It's not enough to destroy evil. You have to help people find the strength to resist it." They watched the sun setting over the town they'd helped free. Already changes were visible. Children played in streets that had once belonged to cartel vehicles. Neighbors spoke freely, without fear of being overheard. Hope had returned to Santa Rosa. "There's a town near the border," Sarah said quietly. "Another cartel just as bad as Ortega. They've heard rumors about what happened here. They're scared." "Good." Isabel checked her weapons. The bow, the knives, the tools that had become extensions of her will. Fear is how it starts. Fear of shadows, fear of justice. Fear that makes monsters look over their shoulders and wonder when their time will come. In his prison cell, Ortega sat alone, staring at nothing. Federal agents had spent hours interrogating him, but he'd said little. What could he tell them that Isabel hadn't already exposed? His empire was gone, his accounts emptied, his allies arrested or in hiding. Decades of power and control, undone by a shadow he'd thought he'd killed years ago. Through his cell window, he watched storm clouds gathering. In their darkness, he imagined he saw her, the girl who had become death itself, the vengeance he had created with his own cruelty. The shadow was spreading. In other cartel-controlled towns, whispers began. Stories of Santa Rosa's liberation traveled through hidden channels. Hope began to flicker in eyes that had been dead for too long. And in those towns' darkness, people began painting the symbol. A shadow that promised justice would come. That evil men would face retribution. That light could return to places lost to fear. Parker's phone buzzed one last time. A message from an unknown number. "Keep it safe. I'll be watching." He deleted the message, knowing Isabel would never return to Santa Rosa. She didn't need to. The town had found its strength, had learned to stand against darkness. Her work here was finished, but across Mexico, other battles waited. Other towns suffered under cartel control. Other people needed to learn that shadows could bring more than fear. Isabel moved through the gathering dusk, a ghost returning to darkness. But she left behind more than just victory. She left hope, strength, and a promise written in the shadow symbol. Justice comes to all who wait in darkness. The war for Santa Rosa was over. But the shadow's mission had only begun. In the years that followed, stories would be told of the girl who brought down an empire. Some said she was a ghost, others an angel of vengeance. To the cartels, she became a nightmare, a shadow that could strike anywhere, that turned their own people against them, that taught their victims to fight back. But in Santa Rosa, they told a different story. They spoke of a quiet waitress who showed them that courage could bloom even in the darkest places, that ordinary people could stand against evil. That hope, once kindled, could never truly die. The shadow's legend grew, spreading like wildfire through hidden channels. Other cartels fortified their compounds, hired more guards, paid for better security, but they couldn't stop what was coming, because Isabel had learned her father's most important lesson. A shadow isn't just darkness. It's a promise that light exists, that dawn will come, that justice, patient but relentless, finds all who deserve it. And in Mexico's darkest places, that promise was taking root. The war had only begun. As midnight approached, Isabel stood on a hill overlooking her next target. Another town, another cartel, another battle between light and shadow. Her phone buzzed one final time, a message from Mateo. "Thank you for giving us back our home." She smiled, touching the pendant that had once been her father's. The shadow symbol gleamed in the moonlight, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Then, she vanished, becoming one with the night. The shadow had work to do. In Santa Rosa, life was returning to normal, but normal had changed. The people walked straighter now, looked evil in the eye instead of turning away. They had learned that darkness holds more than fear. Sometimes it holds justice. Sometimes it holds hope. Sometimes it holds a shadow that moves like death itself, bringing vengeance to those who thought themselves beyond judgment. And in the night, if you listen closely, you might hear whispers of her story, of how one girl brought down an empire, of how a shadow taught people to fight their fears, of how light returns even to the darkest places, but only if you're brave enough to trust the shadows. Fear spread through Mexico's criminal underworld like wildfire. In luxurious safe houses and fortified compounds, cartel leaders gathered to discuss the unprecedented events in Santa Rosa. The fall of Miguel El Diablo Ortega had sent shockwaves through their carefully ordered world, disrupting alliances and shattering assumptions about their invulnerability. In a penthouse overlooking Mexico City, 5 of the most powerful cartel bosses sat around a mahogany table, watching security footage from Ortega's compound. On multiple screens, they saw Isabel moving like a ghost through their worst nightmares, systematically dismantling one of their oldest and strongest allies. One girl, Carlos Herrera, head of the Gulf operations, muttered, "One fucking girl destroyed everything he built." "Not just any girl," replied Victor Ramirez, whose organization controlled the Pacific routes. "La Sombra's daughter, and she's not working alone." The footage shifted to show Santa Rosa's resistance in action. Ordinary people turned warriors, using tactics that spoke of professional training. The shadow network that had once merely observed now acted openly, spreading its influence across territories that had once seemed secure. "She's inspired copycats," announced James Sullivan, an American who handled international distribution. 3 more towns have risen against their local cartels. They're using her tactics, her symbol. The shadow symbol appeared on screen. A mark that had once meant death to their enemies now promised judgment for them all. "We need to kill her," Herrera declared. Put a price so high that every assassin in the world comes hunting. Ortega tried that, Ramirez countered. The black vultures, the butcher, she killed them all, and each failure only adds to her legend. In the corner, the fifth figure finally spoke. Maria Delgado was the youngest among them, but her organization's intelligence network was unmatched. You're all missing the point, she said softly. This isn't about one girl or one town. It's about evolution. She stood, manipulating the display to show a map of Mexico. Red dots indicated areas where resistance movements had sprouted following Santa Rosa's liberation. The shadow network never died after we killed the original La Sombra. It went dormant, gathering intelligence, recruiting assets, waiting for the right moment. His daughter was the catalyst, but the infrastructure was already there. What are you suggesting? Sullivan demanded. We're fighting a ghost story that's become real, Maria explained. Every person we've terrorized, every family we've destroyed, every town we've corrupted, they're all watching Santa Rosa, learning, realizing that we're not invincible. The implications hung heavy in the air. Their power had always relied on fear, the belief that resistance was futile, that submission was the only option. Isabel hadn't just killed Ortega's men, she'd killed that fear. In Washington, D.C., a different meeting was taking place. CIA analysts presented their findings to a select committee, explaining how one small town's revolution threatened to destabilize the entire Mexican drug trade. The shadow network appears to be larger and more sophisticated than previously believed, the lead analyst reported. We've identified cells in major cities across Mexico with possible connections extending into South America. Can we recruit her? A committee member asked. Unlikely. The network's ideology appears to be strictly focused on dismantling cartel power structures and enabling local resistance. They've deliberately avoided political entanglements. Satellite imagery showed the spread of resistance movements, each bearing the shadow symbol. Like a virus attacking corruption's immune system, Isabel's example had triggered something that couldn't be contained. Meanwhile, Mateo had grown into his own role. Now 17, he worked with journalist networks, documenting cartel activities and resistance victories. His father's newspaper had become a digital platform, sharing stories that mainstream media wouldn't touch. Another weapons cache discovered. In Sinaloa, he told his editorial team. The shadow symbol was found painted nearby. His colleagues exchanged knowing looks. They'd all heard rumors about Isabel's continued activities. The assassinations of key cartel figures, the mysterious disappearance of corrupt officials, the liberation of trafficking routes. But Mateo knew more than most. The pendant she'd given him years ago wasn't just a symbol. It was a key to a secure communication network. Through encrypted channels, he helped coordinate information flow between resistance cells, ensuring that Isabel's tactics and training spread to those who needed them most. In Santa Rosa, life had changed dramatically. The town had become a symbol of hope, its successful rebellion inspiring others to resist. Officer Parker, now Chief Parker, had transformed the police force into a model of community protection. William Hayes's clinic had expanded into a full hospital, specializing in treating victims of cartel violence, but they remained vigilant. Other criminal organizations had tried to fill the vacuum left by Ortega's fall, testing the town's defenses. Each attempt was met with unified resistance, the people of Santa Rosa demonstrating that they'd learned their lessons well. Anna Thompson's hardware store had evolved into a community center, where new resistance members from other towns came to train. The Shadow Network used it as a hub, coordinating operations across an ever-expanding territory. Another group arrived from Chihuahua, Thompson told Parker during their weekly security meeting. Same story, tired of living under cartel control, inspired by what we did here. Parker nodded, studying reports from their intelligence network. The cartels are adapting, getting desperate. They're hiring more mercenaries, building bigger compounds. Let them. Thompson smiled grimly. Isabel showed us that bigger compounds just make bigger targets. In a Colombian jungle base, a powerful warlord named Eduardo Vargas watched drone footage of his men training. After seeing what happened in Santa Rosa, he'd quadrupled his security budget, hiring ex-military specialists to prepare for what he believed was inevitable. "She'll come for us eventually," he told his commanders. "We need to be ready." But Isabel was already there, had been for weeks. Disguised as a cook's assistant, she'd mapped his entire operation, identified his vulnerabilities, and made contact with locals willing to resist. The base's communications officer, actually a shadow network agent, transmitted coded messages to resistance cells throughout the region. When the time came, Vargas would learn the same lesson Ortega had. No fortress is truly impenetrable. No organization truly secure. Deep in Mexico City's financial district, Maria Delgado received an unmarked envelope. Inside, she found a single photo, herself, asleep in her supposedly secure penthouse, marked with the shadow symbol. The message was clear. No one was beyond the shadow's reach. Maria had argued for a different approach to the Isabel problem. "We need to adapt," she told her fellow bosses. "The old methods of terror and corruption won't work against this new threat." They hadn't listened. Now, one by one, they were falling. Sullivan had been found dead in his Panama villa, the shadow symbol carved into his desk. Herrera's entire operation had been exposed, his accounts emptied, his men defecting. Ramirez had simply disappeared. Maria made her decision. That night she contacted federal authorities, offering evidence against her former allies in exchange for protection, but she knew no government could truly protect her from the shadow. In a small cafe in Madrid, Isabel sat reading news reports of the latest cartel collapse. Her father's network had grown beyond anything she'd imagined, incorporating hackers, intelligence analysts, and resistance fighters across multiple continents. Sarah joined her, taking the opposite seat. "Delgado turned herself in," she reported. "The Mexico City operation is compromised." "Good," Isabel replied. "What about the Colombian situation?" "Vargas's base is ready. Local resistance cells are in position. They're just waiting for your signal." Isabel nodded, finishing her coffee. The work never really ended. For every cartel they destroyed, another tried to rise. But that was the point. Keep them afraid, keep them running, never let them feel secure enough to truly establish control. Her phone buzzed, a message from Mateo. "You should see Santa Rosa now. We're hosting a regional resistance conference next month. People are coming from all over Mexico to learn." She smiled, remembering the terrified town she'd first encountered. Now it was a beacon of hope, proving that ordinary people could stand against seemingly overwhelming evil. Another message followed, this one from Chief Parker. "Sixth attempt to establish new cartel operations in the region failed. Your lessons stuck." The shadow network had evolved beyond her, becoming a movement that couldn't be stopped by killing any one person. Isabel had shown them the way, but the people had embraced their own power. In cartel-controlled territories, the resistance grew stronger daily. The shadow symbol appeared on walls, in computer systems, in the nightmares of those who had thought themselves untouchable. A promise and a warning. Justice comes to all who wait in darkness. High in the Andes, a cartel compound burned. In the Amazon, trafficking routes were exposed and destroyed. Along the Mexican coast, corrupt officials found their secrets revealed, their power stripped away. The shadow war had become a revolution. Isabel's methods had been adapted and improved upon. Resistance cells developed their own tactics, shared intelligence, and supported each other's operations. The cartels found themselves fighting ghosts on multiple fronts, never knowing where the next strike would come. In his maximum security prison cell, Ortega followed the news with growing despair. Everything he'd built, everything he'd represented, was being systematically dismantled. The age of untouchable cartel kings was ending. A guard delivered his dinner, along with a note bearing the now familiar symbol. The message was simple. "Thank you for teaching me how to destroy an empire." As night fell over Mexico City, Maria Delgado stood in her penthouse one last time. Federal agents would arrive soon to take her into protective custody. But as she looked out over the glittering cityscape, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On the building opposite, a figure stood watching. Even at this distance, Maria recognized Isabel's silhouette. The shadow had come not to kill her but to witness her surrender. When Maria looked again, the figure was gone. But the message remained. The shadow was always watching, always waiting, always ready to strike at those who chose power over justice. In Santa Rosa, children played freely in streets that had once belonged to cartel vehicles. The town had healed its wounds, transforming them into strength. New businesses flourished, schools improved, and hope grew like flowers in what had once been desert. But they kept the shadow symbol painted on the town hall, a reminder of where their freedom had come from, a promise to never again submit to terror and corruption. The revolution Isabel had started couldn't be stopped now. It had taken root in too many hearts, spread through too many channels, inspired too many to stand against darkness. In her temporary base in Colombia, Isabel prepared for the operation against Vargas's compound. But even as she checked her weapons and studied tactical maps, she knew her greatest victory had already been achieved. She had shown people that shadows could bring more than fear, that ordinary men and women could fight back, that hope, once kindled, could spread like wildfire through the darkest night. The cartels would never truly die. Human greed and cruelty would always exist. But neither would the shadow. For every new corruption that arose, a new resistance would form. For every empire built on fear, a revolution would grow in darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, Isabel would be watching, ready to strike, ready to teach others that justice comes to all who dare to fight. The legend of the shadow had become something greater than one person could embody. It had become a promise to the oppressed, a warning to the corrupt, and a reminder that even the most powerful empires can fall to a single spark of resistance. The war continued, but its nature had changed. The Shadow Network fought not just with weapons and tactics, but with hope and inspiration. Each victory sparked new resistance. Each liberated town became a beacon for others. 1 year after Santa Rosa's liberation, the world had changed. In a luxurious Buenos Aires apartment, Diego Ramirez, the youngest cartel boss in South America, studied a blurry surveillance photo. The image showed a woman at a cafe in Argentina, possibly Isabel, possibly another ghost in a war that had become increasingly complex. "Are we certain it's her?" he asked his security chief, Jonathan Hayes, a former CIA operative who'd made a fortune protecting cartel interests. "Facial recognition was inconclusive," Hayes replied, spreading more photos across the mahogany desk. "But the pattern matches. 3 of our lieutenants disappeared last week. Each compound was hit with the same tactics we saw in Santa Rosa." Diego ran his fingers across the glossy photos. At 28, he represented a new generation of cartel leadership, educated, tech-savvy, and acutely aware that the old methods no longer worked. The Shadow War had changed everything. "She's not just one person anymore," he mused. "The symbol, the tactics, the network, it's become something else. A movement." In his Mexico City office, Mateo Richards sorted through encrypted messages from resistance cells across Latin America. Now 20, he'd transformed his father's modest newspaper into a sophisticated intelligence hub, coordinating information flow between Shadow Network operatives. A priority alert flashed on his screen. Facial recognition software had flagged someone matching Isabel's description in Argentina. But Mateo knew better. Isabel never appeared on cameras by accident. "She wants them to see her," he told his assembled team. "Every sighting, every rumor, it's psychological warfare. Keep them jumping at shadows while the real operations proceed undetected." His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Time to activate Protocol Omega." Mateo smiled. The endgame was beginning. In a secret facility beneath the Argentine capital, a shadowy organization called the Council met to discuss the growing crisis. Representatives from various intelligence agencies, private military contractors, and even some cartel interests gathered around a holographic display showing the spread of resistance movements. "The situation is untenable," declared Amanda Pierce, former MI6 operative now working as a private consultant. "What started in Santa Rosa has evolved beyond our control. Traditional power structures are collapsing across the region." Then we adapt, replied Colonel James Harrison, representing several private military interests. If we can't stop the revolution, we co-opt it. Find Isabel. Make her an offer she can't refuse. A quiet laugh echoed from the shadows. The council members spun to find Isabel herself stepping into the light, her movements liquid grace that promised swift violence. You still don't understand, she said softly. This was never about me. Before anyone could react, the facility's lights went dark. When emergency power kicked in seconds later, Isabel was gone, but every screen in the room displayed the shadow symbol, along with detailed files on each council member's illegal activities. We've been compromised, Pierce announced unnecessarily. She was never here for negotiation. This was a data extraction. Across Argentina, carefully planted charges detonated in key cartel facilities. Computer systems crashed, encrypted files were exposed, and offshore accounts emptied. The council's entire infrastructure began to crumble. Diego received the news in his apartment, watching his empire collapse in real time. But he was smiling. Sir? Hayes asked, concerned for his employer's sanity. We're losing everything. No, Diego replied. We're evolving. The old ways are dying. Good riddance. It's time for something new. He opened his safe and removed a familiar pendant bearing the shadow symbol. I've been working with them for months, helping dismantle the structures that killed my father. He was a good man, forced into the cartel life. Isabel showed me another way. Hayes reached for his weapon, but Diego was faster. The syringe found Hayes' neck before he could draw his pistol. Just a sedative, Diego assured his unconscious security chief. Isabel insisted we minimize casualties during the transition. In Santa Rosa, Chief Parker received the signal he'd been waiting for. Operation Omega was proceeding across the continent. Corrupt officials arrested, cartel compounds exposed, trafficking routes dismantled. But more importantly, legitimate businesses and community programs were ready to fill the void. This was always the real endgame, he told his assembled officers. Not just destroying the cartels, but building something better in their place. The shadow network had grown far beyond its origins. For every Isabel, there were now dozens of trained operatives, hundreds of support personnel, thousands of ordinary citizens ready to resist corruption and violence. In a secure facility in Washington, CIA analysts watched the situation unfold, with mixed emotions. We should have seen this coming, the division chief admitted. It was never about revenge or territory. She was building a revolution from the ground up. Their satellites tracked multiple operations proceeding simultaneously across Latin America. But for every confirmed sighting of Isabel, there were a dozen more that couldn't be verified. The shadow had become legion. Mateo's phone buzzed again, another message from Isabel. Remember what I taught you. The shadow isn't just about fighting darkness. It's about showing people they can become their own light. He looked out his office window at the transformed Mexico City street below. Where cartel vehicles once prowled, children now played freely. Local businesses thrived without paying protection money. People walked without fear. Similar scenes were playing out across the continent. The cartels hadn't been destroyed. Human greed and cruelty could never be completely eliminated, but their power had been broken, their mystique shattered. More importantly, people had learned to stand together against corruption. In her current safe house, Isabel watched multiple screens showing the culmination of years of planning. Diego's defection had been crucial, proof that even those born into cartel life could choose a different path. Sarah joined her, bringing coffee and updates. The council is finished. Their files are being released through secure channels. Governments can't ignore the evidence anymore. And the community programs? Fully funded. Diego's donations will support clinics, schools, and small businesses across the region. The legitimate economy is ready to replace cartel control. Isabel nodded, satisfied. My father understood that killing cartel leaders wasn't enough. You have to give people a better option, a reason to resist corruption. Speaking of options, Sarah hesitated. The CIA is making discreet inquiries. They're interested in cooperation. No. Isabel's voice was firm. The shadow network stays independent. We're not trading one form of control for another. Her phone displayed a final message from Mateo. Santa Rosa is hosting another resistance conference. People are calling it the Shadow Summit. You should see what your legacy has become. But Isabel knew she wouldn't attend. Her role was changing, evolving beyond direct action into something more subtle. The next generation of shadows needed space to grow, to find their own ways of fighting darkness. In his prison cell, Ortega watched news reports of his former empire's complete collapse. The guards had stopped bothering to shut off his television. His despair was punishment enough. A new guard appeared at his cell door, one he didn't recognize. She slipped an envelope through the food slot. Inside, a single photo showed Santa Rosa's transformed Main Street, children playing where cartel vehicles once ruled. The shadow symbol was barely visible, painted high on a wall. But it wasn't the original design. This one had evolved, incorporating elements of hope and renewal along with its warning of justice. When Ortega looked up, the guard was gone. But he understood the message. His world was over. The future belonged to the shadows. In Buenos Aires, Diego met with community leaders, discussing plans for legitimate business development. The transition wouldn't be easy. Decades of cartel control had left deep scars. But the people were ready for change. His phone buzzed. "You're doing well. Keep building. The shadows will watch." He smiled, touching the pendant he wore. Some called him a traitor, others a visionary. The truth was simpler. He'd seen a better way and chosen to follow it. Across Latin America, the pattern repeated. Where cartels fell, communities rose. Where corruption withered, hope grew. The shadow network operated continuously, but increasingly, through suggestion and support rather than direct action. Isabel moved through this transformed world like a ghost, watching her revolution mature. She appeared when needed, a word of advice here, a strategic intervention there. But the movement had grown beyond any one person's control. In safe houses and secret meetings, new operatives trained in the shadows' ways. But they learned more than combat and infiltration. They studied community organizing, economic development, social psychology. The next generation of shadows would fight with hope as much as fear. Mateo coordinated it all from his command center, the legendary Isabel, now more myth than person to many of his operators. Few knew she still watched, still guided, still served as the revolution's conscience. "Will it last?" Sarah asked one night, as they watched another cartel compound being converted into a community center. "Nothing lasts forever," Isabel replied. "But we've changed the equation. People know they can resist, they know shadows can bring light." In Washington, London, and other capitals, intelligence agencies maintained their Isabel files. But increasingly, they focused on the movement she'd created, a network that fought corruption through a combination of direct action, community, empowerment, and strategic reform. Some wanted to destroy it, others to control it. But the shadow network remained independent, adapting and evolving. For every operative they identified, another dozen emerged from the darkness. The revolution continued, but it had matured. Violence gave way to transformation. Fear became hope. The shadow war changed from destruction to creation. And somewhere in the darkness, Isabel watched over it all. Not as a warrior anymore, but as a guardian, a symbol of what ordinary people could achieve when they refused to submit to evil. The future remained uncertain. Human nature ensured that corruption and crime would never completely disappear, but neither would the shadows that fought them. In Santa Rosa, where it all began, children played beneath walls bearing the evolved shadow symbol. They grew up knowing that darkness could be resisted, that ordinary people could become heroes, that hope could flourish in the most unlikely places. They didn't know that Isabel sometimes watched from rooftops or alleyways, making sure her first victory remained secure. To them, she was just a story, the girl who became a shadow who taught people to fight their fears. But some stories are more than just tales. Some become promises, possibilities, proofs that the world can change if enough people dare to make it happen. The Shadow War hadn't ended. It had transformed, becoming something deeper and more lasting than one woman's quest for vengeance. It had become a movement, a philosophy, a way of turning darkness into light. And in the night, if you listened closely, you might still hear whispers of her story, of how one girl's fight became a revolution, of how a shadow taught people to find their own strength, of how hope returns, even to the darkest places. But only if you're brave enough to become the light yourself. If this story of vengeance and justice moved you, make sure to subscribe for more gripping tales of those who dare to stand against evil. Hit that like button and let us know in the comments, what kind of monster would you become to fight the devils in your world?